So, I see we have some good people on the joining us. So good to see you.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's begin. So tonight I want to discuss just a little bit more about Reish Lakish. As I've mentioned, the principle of Reish Lakish, I'm going to go back to the Gemara in Gimel Amud Aleph just for a minute, is really the cornerstone of contract law in halacha, and therefore its implications and its parameters and its range, is very crucial to that theme, to that topic. So this gets introduced here by the Gemara on Daf Gimel Amud Aleph, which you have in previous Marmakomos, but probably in this Marmakomos as well. I'm just going to get back to that just for a minute, where the Gemara tells us that, since again, the background is that the Mishnah says that if a get is brought from Medina Sayam, in other words, yeah, Jacob is on, is that it?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I apologize. We were we have a CM tomorrow. I'm sorry I'm late.
Okay, that's Osik Mitzvah. I just wanted to check with you just to confirm, is next week's shir at 6:30? Is that what we said?
Yeah, if that's okay. Just is that okay? We confirm that, right? 6:30?
Yeah.
Okay,
great.
Looking forward. Thank you so much.
So
Thank you.
you'll send it out and people will know.
Yes, we will. Thank you.
Okay, so next Tuesday night, on the theme of Shavuos will be at 6:30. Okay. Anyway, so the Gemara here in Gimel Amud Aleph, trying to explain what is the mechanism and the benefit of the shliach haget proclaiming b'fanei nechtam when he hands over the get to the woman. So the Gemara says that the reason that you do that is because we're concerned that since travel and communication between the Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz could be unreliable, so and there may be a need to authenticate the get if there is some question about its authenticity, about its validity. So proactively they wanted to kind of build in a mechanism that would affirm that this is a real get. Good to see Rabbi Roth. Welcome.
Thank you.
They wanted to show that it was actually going to be a get, so they had the shliach proclaiming b'fanei nechtam. Then the Gemara on Daf Gimel Amud Aleph says, but that shouldn't be enough because we're dealing, with what we call a davar shebe'erba, and cheskas iser, meaning the woman in her marriage is considered to be she's becheskas eishes ish. If we want to change her status by giving a get and by authenticating that get, so then we should need two witnesses because in order to override a status in isha, certainly cheskas iser like eishes ish, you need two witnesses. Al pi shnayim made it. So the Gemara says, so how can a shliach proclaiming b'fanei nechtam, how can that be enough? So the Gemara's answer is based on Reish Lakish, and that's what we've been discussing. Reish Lakish says, that's what the Gemara says here on Gimel Amud Aleph, one more time, just very quickly. The Gemara says, Bedinhu, says the Gemara, Debekim shtaros nami lo libai. Really, the whole requirement to authenticate a contract is only midrabanan. It's only a rabbinic requirement based on the principle of Reish Lakish, who said, Reish Lakish, that Edom achasuim al ashtar nasa commission that Edom who sign onto a shtar, we treat their signatures as if they testified in court, as if they were interrogated by the court and found to be reliable witnesses. So that's a very remarkable idea. What it amounts to is the Gemara basically saying that Reish Lakish provides for a self-affirming mechanism for a contract, meaning a contract is presumed always to be authentic.
What justifies accepting a principle like that of Reish Lakish, who has the understanding and the courage, if I might say, to undertake a a difference of opinion, a dispute with the Torah, which says Al Pishnai Meidim Yakum Davar.
Well, Reish Lakish obviously doesn't think that he's in dispute with the Torah, so he understands that he understands that that Edus Shabashtar is Edus. In other words, he doesn't see this. He certainly doesn't see himself in conflict with the biblical law. He thinks that the biblical law, right, recognizes two types of testimony: oral testimony, which is the more classic one, of testimony.
Two types of if Mishnah made them Yakum Davar.
Correct.
Written this, and it's courageous. I mean,
I'll clean up.
Well, I think Reish Lakish wouldn't
I
say
will
it's
clean up.
courageous, but he probably would agree that it's insightful. But no, you're right. But it's not. Of course, it's he's working within the rules, and he believes these are the rules. So then the question is, but for the very reason that you asked your question in a very sharp way, which reflects the fact that you correctly are observing that Reish Lakish's formulation and his very halacha is very innovative, right? That it's very mechudash. So that is true. I mean, Reish Lakish will tell you it's mechudash, and it's biblical law. And by the way, the fascinating thing is that, as I've said this before, I'm just repeating now, no one disputes Reish Lakish. We are unaware of anybody. Reish Lakish doesn't have a source. The Pnei Yehoshua suggests a source from Yirmiyah, but he doesn't quote a source. And no one disagrees with Reish Lakish, meaning Reish Lakish's position was accepted as being the biblical halakhic authoritative position. So even though it's a huge expansion of what constitutes a testimony, it's undisputed. It would be one thing to say it's disputed, but we paskin like Reish Lakish because of his authority or so on. But there's no dispute. As far as I am aware,
well, I may be mistaken. Wasn't your doctoral dissertation based on Reish Lakish?
Mine?
Yes.
No.
No.
No. I did write a dissertation on Kabbalah's Edus Shalom B'fnei Baldin.
That's
not so much on Shtaros. But I'm just fascinated by it in its own right. I think it's a major topic in halacha, but So basically, this Gemara says that the din of Reish Lakish is a fact. The din of Reish Lakish really makes authentication only a rabbinic requirement, not a biblical requirement. And for that reason, to satisfy the rabbinic requirement, an Eid Echad proclaiming b'fanei nachtam would be sufficient. That's our Gemara. Then what we've been discussing the last 2 or 3 weeks is that there is a secondary argument in the Rishonim, and that is that Rabbi Vigdor, quoted in the Mordechai in Masechet Kiddushin, and the Rambam in Perek Zayin Hilchos Gerushin Halacha Beis are both of the opinion that there's an exception to the absolute application or dominance of Reish Lakish. And they think that this is within Reish Lakish. Namely, if the Baal is Ma'arer, if the in the case of Baal, in the case of a Shtar Kiddushin or a Shtar Gerushin, if the husband were to go to court and he would appeal and say, "This is not, I didn't do this. It's fraud. It's a hoax," or according to Rabbi Vigdor, if the Edom themselves, who are signed, whose name is signed on the document, were to come to court and they were to say, "Listen, it's not our signature. This is a hoax. It says Bob Smith and Brian Jones." But I'm Bob Smith and I'm Brian Jones, and we never signed that document. If that were to happen, according to Rabbi Vigdor, then the need to authenticate the signatures would become a din d'oraisa, a biblical requirement. The Rambam doesn't say anything about the Edom themselves parting company, but he does say that if the Baal is Ma'ara, in the case of Gerushin, that if we were to go ahead just 1 second and rely on this get without further confirmation, then the children produced from a marriage based on this get would be mamzer, which means the Rambam holds that the Rambam and Rabbi Vigdor both hold that there are circumstances, irur habal, and according to Rabbi Vigdor also irur ha'edim. Irur means means a legal challenge. In both of those circumstances, according to Rabbi Vigdor, and one of them, according to the Rambam, the requirement of kiyum shtaros is min Torah. And therefore, the question that arises, I'll take your question in just 1 second, I just want to finish the sentence, is based on the Gemara on Vav Omid Beis. Because the Gemara on Vav Omid Beis says very clearly, I'm going to read it just for 1 second. If you don't have it in front of you, that's fine. But the Gemara here says that, even though you don't need B'fanei Nachta in Eretz Yisrael, only between Chutz La'aretz and Eretz Yisrael. But let's say you wrote a get within Eretz Yisrael, and the shliach proclaimed b'fanei nachtam, even though he didn't have to. So the Gemara says, if that happens, then it'll be effective. So if the Gemara in Avamid Beis, the first line, be of this, if within Eretz Yisrael, the shliach says b'fanei nachtam, ahanis, it works. So the Gemara says, of this Hanis. What does that mean? If he did it, it works. Works for what? Says the Gemara, the asi baal uma'arer lo mashgachinan be. Because if the Baal were to come and say the whole thing is a hoax, right? If the shliach says b'fanei nachtam, then we will believe the shliach and we will ignore the challenge or the appeal of the Baal.
That's pashtus.
The question is, isn't that Gemara? Why is that Gemara not against the Rambam? Why is that Gemara not against Rabbi Vigdor? So actually, the Shach in Siman Memvav, Sif Katan Tes. What happens is in Shulchan Aruch there are several things that go on. Number one, the Shulchan Aruch paskins that kiyum shtaros is drabanan, like our Gemara, meaning the need to authenticate a document like a contract is only a rabbinic requirement. But the Shulchan Aruch goes further. The Shulchan Aruch says, and therefore, if I could just go refer to the Marmakomos for a minute, where are the Marmakomos? Oh, I put them over here. 1 second. I'm not in my usual location, so just bear with me for a moment. So in the Marmakomos, which were given out a few weeks ago, which I'm going to be referring to tonight, if you look at the Shulchan Aruch, this would be on page 2. Shulchan Aruch says, "Ein mekayim shtaros." This is Siman Mem Vav Sif Dalet. Ein mekayim shtaros ela b'shlosha. If there's a question of authenticating a contract, you need 3 judges. Mibnei shudin, because it's a din, and therefore you need 3 judges. Then the Shulchan Aruch says, "Ulefikach." Therefore, ein mekayim shtaros balayla, since it's considered a din, it's a legal act. Therefore, you can't do it at nighttime. Legal acts, Bezdin only meets during the day. Hagot. Then the Ramah says, "V'im kimu b'shnayim lo avakiyum." If you use two judges, it wouldn't be valid. However, then he adds in the name of the Trumas Hadash, and this is really interesting. V'yesh mishakasav shenogu sharava tofes yeshiva makayim bichidi. Minag kazem bevatal halacha. V'chena minag pashut b'medina selu. V'nirli atam the svirlan le'inyan kim shtaros drabanan. So the Ramah says there was a minhag, it's quoted in the Trumas Hadashen, that if somebody was a big expert in halacha, that he could be Makayim Ishtar on his own. He wouldn't
Not
need
by
judges. What?
Not by Arias.
We're talking about he's just talking about general Kiyum Shtaros.
That applies to Gittin also?
Presumably.
That's
I'll explain why in a minute, because the Kiyum Shtaros is about the signature. We're not talking about the Adim on the Kiyum Shtaros. We're talking about the judges, the people who hear.
But to judge Arias, you need 3, no?
Say that again?
To judge an issue of halacha that involves Arias, Erebus, you need 3, no?
No, it's not so clear. I mean, probably. But what we're saying is that what the Ramah is saying is the whole requirement of Kiyum Shtaros anyways is only Drabanan. And since this is a rabbinic requirement, we're more makil on applying it. So we go with Yachin Mumcha. Then the next line in the Ramah goes further and says that actually Bizman Hazeh, which means since like the medieval period. He says, "V'apagav de'ein yachid mumcha b'zman hazeh, mikomokom linin kim shtaros d'Rabbanan yesh lismach alav kein nirali b'tam amina." So it's like a double hula, because on the one hand, it's you don't need 3 judges, you need only 1.
And we don't have the one.
And even the one shouldn't
don't have
apply.
it.
What?
We don't have the one. There's no mumcha anymore.
Right. So we're saying Le'inyan Kim Shtaros, somebody whose knowledge in Jewish law is impressive.
It's diluted to the nth degree.
So this is all based on Kim Shtaros Rabbanan. So this is what the Shach says. The Shach says, listen, the Ramah's quoting significant kulas, right? He's being very lenient about this halacha. But according to the Rambam, he's saying, and according to the Rabbi Vigdor, there are cases where if the Baal is Ma'arer or the Edom are Ma'arer, then the Kim Shtar should be Daraisa. So how come the Shulchan Aruch isn't telling us that in a case of Ir Rabal or in a case of Ir Ha'edim, there you can't rely on Yachid Mumcha. And even if you couldn't rely on a Bizman Hazeh. How come all these kulas from the Gemara on down, which are based on Kim Shtaros being Darabanan, how come they're all effective if in fact Kim Shtaros is occasionally Torah? Says the Shach, you see from here that Rabbi Vigdor and the Rambam are wrong, that all cases of Kim Shtaros are Darabanan, and therefore we can be Mekil because the whole thing is only a rabbinic requirement. However, even the Shach, in the end of the day, in the end of the piece, says, you know what? I'm convinced about Ir Rabal. If the Baal is the one, you mean the other party, the protagonist, in the case, if he's the one who levels the challenge or the appeal, excuse me, then we ignore it on a Doraisa level. It's only a rabbinic requirement. However, says a Shach, you know what? I'm not so sure if Rabbi Vigdor is not wrong about the Edom themselves coming to court and saying, listen, we never signed this. That might be a different story. So this is a really interesting question. But what he's saying is, what about my argument before, which is that, it should have been registered in the dinim. They should have said all these kulas of Kim Shtaros only being Drabanan don't apply in cases where the Edom come to court, then they say we didn't do it, we didn't sign it. He says, well, that's such a rare case, that you don't have to really, relate to that. The idea of Baal being Ma'arer, the protagonist, that's a much more common case. But either way, the Shach says my biggest proof
in the whole incident to Baal.
Yeah, exactly. So, but the Shach says my biggest proof against the Rambam and against Rabbi Vigdor is from the Gemara on Davav Beis, the one that I just quoted. Namely, the Gemara there says that if you have the Fanei that it works against Ir Rabal. But according to the Rambam and Rabbi Vigdor, Ir Rabal is Kiyum Daraisa. How can it be Kiyum Daraisa? It's only Eid Achad. It's you're treating it like Yisurim, not like Dover Shebe'erva. How can you do that if it's Daraisa? So that is the question that they ask against the Rambam. And I want to try to discuss a couple of solutions to that problem to better understand the Rambam and Rabbi Vigdor going forward. But first, you had a question, and
In the case that you mentioned where the 2 Edom come and say, hey, it's not our signature. Does it make a difference if the Edom come before it was put before Bezdin or after it was?
Oh, so that is that's great.
Because we know that there's a difference in the role of Edom clashing, whether they come afterwards or at the same time.
Right, that's a great point. So that is the suggestion of the Beis Shmuel. Beis Shmuel is the prime, just like, you have the Sma and Choshen Mishpat, you have the Beis Shmuel. He is the main Perush in Even Ezer. So in Siman, I believe this is the right Siman, something like that. I think it's Kuf Mem Beis, close to it if not, either Kuf Mem Beis, Kuf Mem Daled. In Even Ezer, where this discussion, this Rambam is codified, in the Shulchan Aruch. I mean, the Rambam that says that if the Baal is Ma'arer, if he disputes the get, that the Kiyum Shtaros becomes Doraisa, and if you don't heed it, if you don't attend to it, then if the woman were to go ahead and remarry just on the basis of the get, the children from that subsequent marriage would be mamzerim. So on that discussion, the Beis Shmuel and Siman Kuf Mem Beis and Even Ezer quotes the Shach's question He says the Shach in Choshen Mishpat Siman Memvav, asked this unbelievably difficult. He points out that there's a Gemara that seems to totally dispute the Rambam and Rabbi Vigdor. He said, what do we do with that? So the answer that he gives, you were mechaving just now to the answer of the Beis Shmuel. That's the answer that the Beis Shmuel suggests. Beis Shmuel says there's a difference between two cases. There's a difference between a case where the Baal was ma'arer before the get, was, brought to Bezdin, or the Irur Habal took place after Bezdin already received the get. He says, if the Irur takes place prior to the Bezdin receiving the get, then Kim Shtar, that's what the Rambam meant when and that's what Rabbi Vigdor meant when they said that Irur Habal creates Kim Shtar Storaisa. However, if the court already has the document, and when they received it, their assumption was that it was all Kadasu Kedin based on Reish Lakish, based on Edom Achsuma Shtar Nasi Kamijnech of the Bezdin. If that's what happens, then Chanami, the ability of the Baal to be Ma'arer would only be Drabanan, not Doraisa, because the Bezdin already looks at the Shtar, in a very different way. And as such, the Kiyum Shtaros would only be Drabanan. So basically, the Gemara on Vav Amud Beis, which is establishing the effectiveness of B'fanei Nachtam even against Irur Habal, is a case where the Irur Habal takes place after the get has already appeared or surfaced in court. Now, the question is, why should it matter? So you just said a second ago that sometimes it matters. So where do we find that it matters? Meaning, in the end of the day, what difference does it make if you have two sides? You have a shtar, you have Reish Lakish, and you have a disputed story.
Lakish's rule,
that
the shtar stands on its own, so to speak, feet, is
Right.
only when the shtar becomes official when it's presented to Bezdin. Until it's presented to Bezdin, it doesn't have that koach.
So that's very possible. If you look carefully at by the way, if you look carefully in the tshuva of the Or Zarua, which we read about 3 weeks ago, I guess, because we didn't have a shir last week, but 2 shiurim ago, we read the tshuva of the Or Zarua. And in the tshuva of the I didn't read that part of it because it's a very, very, very long tshuva. And I think I was probably pushing it, as it was, reading so much of it, although I'm always excited by it. But anyways, in the continuation of that very long tshuva, the Or Zarua slips in this distinction, the way that you just said it. And it's very remarkable that people didn't pick up on it because it's such, an astonishing distinction. It's not obvious at all. But the Or Zarua says what you say, which
You're almost forced to say it.
If you make this distinction, yeah. He says that the din of Reish Lakish, applies only if the shtar makes it to the Bezdin, before it's disputed. And again, it's I don't think that everybody agrees with him, frankly, but that's what the Or Zarua says. The Beis Shmuel may have something a little bit different in mind. For him, is the question, when did the shtar come to Bezdin, or when did the Irur take place? Did the Irur take place before the shtar takes place? Is it about the timing of the Irur, or is it about the timing of the shtar, or is that just semantics? But anyways, let me give you a couple examples where we find this phenomenon, and I'm not sure if it's exactly the same halacha or not. Depends on other things, which I'm not going to go into right now, but at least there are parallel cases. So let me give you an example, a couple of examples of it. So there's a famous, position of Ula, which we'll talk more about in our next topic. Our next topic, I want to discuss some of the parameters of Eidechad Namon B'Yisurim. But what Ula says is as follows. There are 3 cases where the status of Eidechad is particularly powerful. One is Eidechad Besota, Eidechad who is attesting to a betrayal of the marriage by
Depends on which level is in the machlokes in that.
Yeah, let's say that's called Eidechad Betuma. In other words, there was what we call kinui and stira. And now, and then she was warned, she was
That's
still in
fresh
the
in our
company.
mind. Stop Yomi.
What? Oh, they're finishing Sota now.
Yeah. So it's
And I hear you have a celebration tomorrow.
Siyum coming up, yes.
Okay, so Mazel Tov to the Saimim. Anyway, so it's very relevant, as you know. So in Eid Echad B'Sota is one example. The other example is Eid Echad B'Misa Sabal, Eid Echad who is believed to establish that a husband died so that the wife can move forward. We'll discuss that more extensively in a couple of minutes. And the third one is Egla Rufa, having to do with the famous, procedure of what happens if you find like an anonymous corpse, in the city limits or whatever. And there's a whole process of Egla Rufa. When do you need that? When don't you need that?
That's the Daf Yomi today. Tomorrow.
Oh, okay. See,
End of Sota.
see, we're always doing Daf Yomi in one way or another. What's the next one? Gittin, actually, right?
Getting this next, yeah.
Hopefully there'll be a lot from Bill, because we've been jumping around a lot. But we've actually touched on a lot of different themes. But anyways, so Ula said the following. This is the famous statement of Ula. Kol makom shehemina Torah eid achad harei kan shnai. Whenever the Torah accepts the authority of a single aid, he meant it regarding these three cases, at least. We're not sure about the rest. That's a dispute, and we'll get back to that. But for now, Ula at least said Egla Rufa, Misa Sabal, and Sota, Kol Makom Shemina HaTorah, Eid Echad, whenever the Torah accepts the authority of an Eid Echad, Harei Kan Shnayim. We treat them as two. What does that mean? What does that mean? Why not just say, we believe the Eid Echad? So the Gemara explains that you can have two scenarios. Let's say the Eid Echad comes to court and he says what he says, and Bezdin, only heard from this Eid Echad, and they were makabel. They processed. They received his testimony, and then what's called bezeh charzeh, not bevasachas, not together, but separately. Another aid shows up in court, and he disputes the first aid. And as Reuven came to court, and he said this woman betrayed her marriage vows, or he came to court and said this husband, I took his pulse, I saw that he died, etc. And then let's say bezeh charzeh, an hour later, 10 minutes later, a month later, it doesn't make a difference. Not bevasachas, not together. Another aide comes to court, Shimon, and he says, "Not true. This betrayal never took place." Or
1 against 2.
It's 1 against 2 because of the din of Ula. That's a legal concept.
So therefore, he can't do anything to the second
Yeah.
one.
So that's the din that when Ula said, "Kol makom shemina Torah eid echad harei kan shnayim," what he was saying was, even though it's 1 against 1, we treat it as if it's 2 against 1. And now the question is, but of course, if they came b'vasachas, let's say Reuven and Shimon came to court at the same time. One said the man died, I took his pulse, and the other one said, "What are you talking about? He was coughing, he was breathing, he was joking. He wasn't dead at all." Or one said that she betrayed the marriage, and the other one said, "What are you talking about? She's the most loyal, pious person ever. This never
And they
happened."
cancel
Or what
each
you
other
think.
out, basically, right?
So that's called bevasachas, and if it's bevasachas, we throw them both out of court. So isn't that a very remarkable halacha that depending on the timing, it's the same Reuven and the same Shimon. If they come to court together, they knock each other out. If Reuven comes to court before Shimon, somehow, Shimon doesn't have the capacity, right, to neutralize him. And the question is, why not? That's one example. There might be other explanations, but that's
The why not is understandable. The question is, on what basis do we have these 3 exceptions that Ula brings up? Once you accept those exceptions,
3 exceptions, we'll get back.
It's really logical why.
Well, you know what? I'm going to give you a suggestion about why the 3 are different, that are unique. If they are unique, that's a debate, because other people think that Ula's din applies to other Eid Echad and Bisurim as well, even though they're stated in these cases. But I'm going to give you a suggestion which is going to be, a unified theory that's going to answer both questions. Okay? And that is that these three, unlike regular Echad, Nem, and Bisurim, all do require processing by Bezdin. That's most Echad, Nem, Bisurim does not require Bezdin. Like if you want to know whether I'm going to give you another example in a minute. Your meat is kosher or treif. That has nothing to do with, doesn't have to have anything to do with Bezdin, right? But if you want to establish that this woman betrayed her marriage vows, or that this other woman is free to remarry, etc., or even Egla Rufa, which is a matter of Bezdin, why does that matter? Because maybe the bigger idea, if this is so, there might not be so, but I'm going to, go according to this perspective right now. Maybe the bigger idea here is that there are two different issues. One is the authority of the source, right? And the authority of the source doesn't change if it's Bezeh Charzeh or Bevasachas. If Reuven and Shimon come to court at the same time, it's the same Reuven and the same Shimon in terms of their credibility, in terms of their, stature, etc. Right? As single Adim attesting, to a fact or a non-fact, Reuven and Shimon are equal in every way, and it doesn't matter whether they came together or they came separately. What's the wild card? What makes the timing different? The answer is maybe Bezdin, meaning once Bezdin, there are threshold and standards for Bezdin to, to process or to receive information. But once something has been received by Bezdin, that gives it stature. It becomes a fact that is embraced or endorsed or processed by the court. What's that?
It's a Zilzal Bezdin issue?
No, Zilzal Bezdin is probably a Din D'Rabbanan. And that just has to do with, or if it is a Din D'Oraisa, but it's still based on the broader impact or effect of Bezdin. This is something far more objective, meaning once Bezdin, once something gets into the court system, even through the back door,
It takes an added strength.
it assumes a certain stature of evidence, and then it's harder to dispute it. This is what I'm trying to say. I'll give you another example from the Rambam. The Rambam in Hilchos Sanhedrin, hold on one second. Maybe I should really read this inside. Just give me a second. I should have put it on the sheet. Again, I'm not home, but okay. I'm not home, but I wouldn't go anywhere that didn't have a good library. So in Hilchos Sanhedrin, Perek Tes, I'm at my daughter's house as it happens. So in Hilchos Sanhedrin, Perek Tes Zayin, Halacha Vav, the Rambam says a very remarkable din. Well, we're going to speak more about this, but this is a very, very important halacha. He says as follows. Eino tzarech, I should have put it on the sheet, but I didn't, but you'll forgive me. Eino tzarech shnei edim l'malkus, el b'shas maisa. Rambam says, let's say you have a din Torah that revolves around, because the consequence is whether or not you're going to give somebody malchus. Malchus is corporal, punishment, lashing. Okay, you give that for somebody who violated, a lav, a severe lav. So the Rambam says you need to, in order to punish somebody with malchus, you need two witnesses, right? Reasonable? Just like Dine Mamonis and just like Ereva, you need for onshim, Misas Bezdin for sure, but even for physical, punishment like malchus, I'm sorry. Yeah. But the way that the Rambam says it in Yasra too. However, the Rambam says that's true only if we're talking about a din Torah that revolves around malchus directly, frontally, meaning there's some discussion in the court whether Reuven did something that requires malchus, and the evidence that would be able to convict him, there has to be two witnesses. Aval, says the Rambam, listen to this, ha'isur atzmo be'edechad yuchsak. But if it's more indirect, if it's more like a two-step process, if the facts come to the court that in turn, I'll explain in a minute, have implications for malchus, those facts can be established in some circumstances by an Eid Echad. Ketzad, for example, Amar Eid Echad Chelev Klayos Huzeh. Let's say an Eid Echad comes to court, and he says, you see that piece of meat, right? That is chelev. That's
And
non-kosher
two
meat.
others are the ones that said he ate it.
1 second. Or kilaya kerem heim peroselu. Or he says, you see that fruit? It's kilaya kerem. It's you can't eat it. It's also to eat it. Or he comes to court and he says, you see this woman, grusha ozona he ishazu. This woman is a divorcee.
But
Nothing
there's
wrong with
there's two other separate Adam that say he did it. They're just identifying.
No. 1 second. Then what happens is, listen, the ochal al be'edim achar shehusrabo. So now, after let's take the first case, it's easiest. The Eid Echad came, a single Eid came to court and he said that piece of meat, is treif. And then this guy in the courtroom, picks it up and he's about to eat it. They say to him, listen, it's treif. Don't eat it. Right? And he eats it. So the Rambam says he's chayiv malchus.
Wait a minute, are there Adam that he ate it?
Yeah. There are Adam that he ate it, but there's no Adam that it's chaylev. There's only an Eid Echad that it's chaylev.
But Echad is enough by Yisurim.
Yes, but this is Isurim that impacts
No,
malchus.
because what we needed to Adam for is to say that he ate it. We already know.
Right, but
that it's
let's
chaylev.
say he ate it. Let's say he ate something. And then you had an Eid Echad who came to court and said, by the way, what he ate really was chaylev after after he ate it. If they came after he ate it, Rambam says we wouldn't accept their testimony. That's what the first words mean. Eino tzarich shnei edim l'malchus ela b'shas ma'isa. Aval ha'isur atzmo be'eid echad yuchsak. It's a famous line in the Rambam. It's a terrific formulation, right? Harei zaloka afal b'she'ikar ha'isur be'eid echad. So here you have Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim, which is processed by Bezdin, accepted as a fact, and then it has impact in a Malchus case. But if you were in the middle of a Malchus case and then you wanted to hear testimony to identify the object, the Bezdin wouldn't hear it from an Eid Echad.
But it has to
As
follow
threshold,
the chronology.
Bamedvar Mamurim, B'Shelo Hikhish. Okay, that's okay, fine. Anyways, this position of the Rambam is something that the Rambam mentions in other places in his Yad HaChazaka. We're going to come back to it when we talk about Yachanam Bisurim. Suffice it to say that the Rambam says something similar to this in Hilchos Nazir, in Hilchos Shkagos, and in Perek Aleph Hilchos Isurei Bia and Perek Chaf Hilchos Isurei Bia. You might also be relating to this question. In other words, the Rambam deals in Mishnah Torah with this problem almost at least 5 times. And it's a very fascinating issue. But what's the upshot? Why am I quoting it now? Timing, in both Ula case and the Rambam case, timing matters. Meaning, if you were to, if the Bezdin,
It's order more than timing, no? It's the sequence.
Oh, the sequence. Okay. In some cases, it's a timing. In other cases, sequence. But it's the same principle. Meaning, if Bezdin comes to this piece of information and they process it while it's undisputed, then it assumes a certain legal standing, which catapults it, if you will,
You have
in
to
terms of being
establish
negated, or what?
You have to establish the fact before the ADUS on the transaction, on the trend.
Or before the implications.
Yeah.
But if it's in the context of, or in a disputed context, then the acceptance or the processing of these facts become, perceived as something different. They're part of a Malchus case, or they're part of a... Exactly. Then you need to wait it. So that's a very subtle difference. So I think whether it's the Or Zarua's emphasis on Reish Lakish or the Beis Shmuel's emphasis on when did the Ir Rabal take place, when did the Bezdin know about it, I think it's a similar, kind of phenomenon, and a very fascinating one at that. So that is one approach. There's a second approach, and a third approach, and a fourth approach. So let me, to answer the position of the Rambam from the question of the Shach. So let me mention option number 2. So the Lechem Mishnah in Perek Zayin of Hilchos Gerushin, Halacha Beis, says maybe I have an answer for the Rambam, and then he, backs away from it. What's the maybe? He says, listen, in the Gemara of Gimel Amid Aleph that we've been discussing, right? The Gemara says what? Initially, the Gemara says B'fanei Nachtam only helps because Kiyum Sharos is D'Rabbanan. Then the Gemara goes on to say, so why does it work? Bishum Aguna Hikila Be'Rabban. Because since it's only a rabbinic requirement, right? And we don't want to hold up, her resumption of, of a normal life. We want her to be able to proceed, in living, as she would prefer. So we're makil, we're lenient since it's only a rabbinic requirement. So we're going to, be lenient and allow a single aid, to solve the problem. Right? That's what the Gemara says. But then the Gemara goes on to say, if you remember, we discussed this extensively. The Gemara says, you think you're really doing her a favor by being lenient, meaning by lowering the standard of what you require, you might actually end up, countermanding the goal of making her life easier, because if you allow a single aid to be the source of the authenticity of this get, then you might be inviting, because it's flimsier than 2 Eidim, you might be inviting an appeal from the Baal. Maybe it's better to require a more rigorous standard, and thereby to discourage any kind of appeal. That was the Gemara's consideration. As we've discussed a couple of times already, this is an objective, legal issue in general. In other words, about standards. We've discussed it already. Okay. Now the question is, so what does the Gemara answer to that question? The Gemara says, no. Really, it's fine. Being lenient on the standards and in the threshold is the right thing in this case. And the reason is because there are protections in place. What are the protections? The Gemara says, because you have to hand over this get in the presence of 2 or 3 others, and therefore Meidak Dayek, the person, everybody who's involved is going to be very careful to make sure that this really is an authentic get. So that's the line where the Gemara says,
what can they do to make sure? I mean, I want to be careful.
Even the Amar Mar bifnei kamanosna, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Chanina, Chalamar Shnayim, Chalamar Gimel, Mikara Meidak Dayek v'lo asi la'arue nafshe. So the Gemara says that there's an argument in the Rishonim whether there's a reference to the Isha or it's a reference to the
What can they do? They can't do anything.
Who?
Be more careful. What can they do at this point?
No, to make absolutely sure that that what the Eid Echad is saying, is.
Whether they're going to cross-examine. I mean, what can they do?
I mean, they can investigate.
Testimony.
They could try to find out, that he was really in that place, that he was, capable of knowing the difference when it comes to, a proper signature and a proper.
So when the Eid Echad finishes his testimony, what you're saying is that instead of their taking it at face value, they still should do due diligence?
No, we're saying that somebody is doing due diligence on top of the Eid Echad here, and therefore we're not really concerned that the more lenient standard is one that will invite appeals, because there's an assumption that there's an additional stringency in the way that this is handled that offsets.
Does Ula treat this witness as two?
Say again?
Does Ula treat this witness as two? Is that
no, because this isn't Misa Sabal, this is B'fanei Nachta. But you're not wrong that there's a parallel. We'll get to that in just a minute. So actually, let me mention that right now. So this idea, the Gemara uses this expression, Meidak Dayek, That's what it means. You can ask, what does that mean? But in the end of the day, the words Medek Dayak mean that extra care and therefore a greater sense of confidence in the B'fanei Nachtam is going to apply because of Medek Dayak. Now, there's an additional factor. So let me, before I get to the parallel, let me tell you what the Lechem Mishnah proposes. Lechem Mishnah says, listen, the problem of the what's the problem of the Rambam? Problem is that the Rambam seems to say that when there's Ir Rabal, that there's din of Kiyum Daraisa. If it's Kiyum Daraisa, then how can B'fanei Nachtav help you? That's only an Eid Echad. If there's Kiyum Daraisa, you should require Shnai Eidim. Says the Lechem Mishnah, that's what the Gemara said, and the Gemara said Kiyum Shtaros is Drabanan. That's what the Gemara said before it introduced the factor of Medek Dayak. But once it introduces the factor of Medek Dayak, that's an added rigor, right, to combine with the Eid Echad. So it's true that the Gemara says that the only reason Eid Echad would work is because Kiyum Shtaros is Drabanan, and that's a problem for the Rambam. But the Rambam, who seems to say that Kiyum Shtaros, that B'fanei Nachtam of an Eid Echad will work even for Kiyum Shtaros Daraisa, is basing on the fact that 2 or 3 lines after that, the Gemara introduces that in addition to the Eid Echad, there's also a factor of Medek Dayak. So when you combine Eid Echad and Medek Dayak, maybe that'll work even on a Daraisa level. That's a Lechem Mishnah's suggestion.
The Daraisa is very clear. You need 2 Eidim. It doesn't say 1 8 plus something. So the Rabbanim,
Okay.
can say that. It's not a very.
Right, but you can. I mean, that's your view. That's great. Probably most people agree with you. But you can see we're trying to. In other words, Rambam is facing a stira. You can see how they're asking based on the Gemara in Gimel and Aleph. The only thing that should work is Kiyum Shtaros Drabanan. And according to the Rambam, there's Kiyum Shtaros Daraisa. And in the case where the Rambam says is that there's Kiyum Shtaros Daraisa, but B'fanei Nachtam is still working. That's against the Gemara in Gimel and Aleph. How do you explain it's against the Vav between Vav and Beis and Gimel and Aleph? You have a total contradiction.
We can show a difference, but it doesn't rise to eliminate it.
So that's the question. When you have a difference, the question is, does it rise to the level of a consequential difference or not? Is it inconceivable that this one might, because it adds rigor, maybe sufficient? Maybe it's an open question. I would say, I wouldn't just be so dismissive. I would say it's an open question. You'll see in a moment the Noda B'Yehuda is pretty dismissive. We'll see that in a second. However, if you ask me,
the Torah uses a duplicate lashon, Pishnayim Eidim, not one. it makes it very clear.
Right, so that might mean Shnayim and not Echad. But if let's say you have Echad and something else, maybe it's a little different. Either way, that's
the burden is definitely on trying to support that theory. Because
if we didn't have the problem, what does the Rambam and Rabbi Vigdor do with these 2 Gemaras? Then we wouldn't be, reevaluating and looking, and weighing whether these differences are sufficiently consequential. No, you're totally right. But we do have to explain the Gemara according. The Rambam and Rabbi Vigdor had to read the Gemaras. So how did they read them, right? Okay. So just for everybody's information, what's the story with this idea? So the Lechem Mishnah suggests it, and then he rejects it. But he doesn't reject it for your reason. Namely, he doesn't reject it because he says anything less than 2 Eidim is never going to work. Or that you can't combine Eid Echad and a Rov, let's say, or a Diuk. He says, listen, the Gemara introduced this factor of Diuk not because of Kiyum Shtaros, but because of the policy question. Are you doing her a favor by lowering the standards, or are you working against her by lowering the standards because you're inviting an appeal? So there's a very specific motivation for the Gemara to add the diuk. It didn't add it in context of strengthening the Eid Echad. It added it, right, in order to explain why Mishum Aguna Hikila Barabanan is a good policy here and not one that's likely to blow up in your face. So the Lechem Mishnah says, it's true that the Gemara introduced an additional factor that might combine, but there's no evidence that that's why it introduced it, and therefore it's just not enough. Okay, the Pnei Yoshua, in his commentary, doesn't quote the Lechem Mishnah, but he gives a suggestion, and as one of three suggestions, and thinks that even though the Gemara didn't introduce it to solve this problem, but once it's introduced, maybe the Rambam and Rabbi Vigdor made note of it, and that's how they solve the problem. Okay, the Noda B'Yehuda disagrees. So before I tell you what the Noda B'Yehuda says, a little bit of background. So there is you brought up the question of Eid Echad B'Misa Sabal. There is a parallel, as we've discussed, not only the Ula aspect of it, but a more, straightforward parallel to what we've been discussing. I mean, there are two ways to exit an Ishus. One is through a get, and the other is through Misa Sabal. Now, on the surface, the problem is the same problem. In both cases, she's an Eishes Ish, and we're trying to, she's a married woman, that's their presumptive status, and we're trying to establish whether or not she's now a free woman, meaning whether the change, get or Misa Sabal, took place or not. So it's a parallel problem. But as we know, Eid Echad B'Misa Sabal is also Nem. Now, is that Doraisa or Dorabana? On the surface, and the Gemara itself discusses this in the beginning of 10th parak of Yevamos. The Gemara says it's almost the same Shaklavataria we have here. The Gemara says, listen, this is not Eid Echad B'Sur because she's an Eishes Ish, and this is a Davar Shebe'erba. So how does Eid Echad B'Misa Sabal work? So the Gemara in Yevamos on Pei Ches Samad Aleph in the beginning of the 10th parak, Ka'isha Rabbah, so the Gemara says, listen, you know why it works? Something that sounds an awful lot. So I'll there are two Gemaras. The one on Pei Ches Samad Aleph says the following: Mitoch, this is language. Mitoch chomer shechmarta aleha b'sofa hekalta aleha b'tchila isha medak daika uminsava. What does that mean? So again, this goes back to something that we discussed 2 weeks ago that you got a little bit intrigued by. But let's say a woman legitimately remarries because an Eid Echad came to court and Bezdin accepted the testimony and said, okay, you can get remarried. They said the guy came to court and he said, I saw your husband, I took his pulse, he's deceased.
Not coming back.
And then, of course, I don't know if he shows up. If he showed up at the wedding, it wouldn't be so bad. But that probably wouldn't be very pleasant. But but he shows up at the bris. That's the problem, or some subsequent time. Ba'harog baraglav. So the Mishnah says, "Teitzei mizeh mizeh." Even everybody's an onus. No one did anything wrong here, but it's still a tragedy. So that's what the Gemara means.
High risk, high reward.
Yeah. So, but high risk, high reward is what the Gemara means when it says she knows this. Mitoch chomer shechmarta aleha b'sofa hekalta aleha b'tchila isha daika uminsava. What that means is, listen, we know it's Eid Echad, and we know it's problematic, but the stakes are very high risk and high reward. I like what you said, meaning she knows.
Are we ascribing an intuitive knowledge that the woman has as to whether her husband's alive or dead?
No, not at all. Not at all. What we're saying is that if somebody says to her, listen, I was with him and he fell into Mayim Shelem Sof, or even I was with him and he didn't have a pulse, then is she just going to rely on that, or is she going to check into the mental condition and the veracity of the aid? Is she going to, let's see, he says, Mayim Shelem Sof, I saw him fall into the Pacific or the Atlantic or the Mediterranean, and no one bobbed up, after an hour. But we all know crazy things can happen. Yonah was swallowed by the whale. So whatever it was. See, the point is, there was an air pocket. So she's going to launch her own investigation. She's not just going to rely on the Eid Echad. That's what the Gemara means. Mitoch chomer shechmarta aleha b'sofa, because if she gets it wrong, if everybody gets it wrong, it's a disaster. Hekalta aleha b'tchila isha daika mitzvah. We don't assume she's just going to take the word of the Eid Echad. We assume that she is also going to launch her own investigation. And because that is the case, So what is that, Doraisa or Drabanan? So the Balitosis in Yavamos say a strange thing. They say, I mean, it's strange and it's enigmatic, just hard to pin down. The Tosis there says, Daiko Mitzvah doesn't make this Neman Doraisa. But it's also not an Akiras Davar Min Torah. It's Midrabanan. It's a rabbinic, we're relying on a rabbinic license here, but it's not considered Akiras Davar Min Torah. That's a very nuanced, meaning Midoraisa you should require more, but Midrabanan we're going to let you rely on this. However, some Mefarshim say that it's really Doraisa. So how does that become Doraisa? But the Pnei Yeshua, when he makes his comment, when he rehabilitates the Lechem Mishnah without quoting him, he says, there's a parallel to saying that Isha Medayekes can be added to an Eid Echad, namely that's the Gemara in Yevamos. Assuming that Gemara is Doraisa, not just Rabbanan, which from the Gemara you could say.
But that's Iguna. That's a special thing by Iguna. We've talked about this. I mean, you can't learn that to other cases.
What we're talking about, Mishum Iguna Kilo, the case of Eid Echad B'Misabal and the case of Gerushin are both cases where the Gemara applies Mishum Aguna Hikilo. We're only applying this to two cases, applying it to substantiating a get so she can move forward, and we're talking about substantiating the edus of Eid Echad B'Misa so she can move forward. In both cases, it's to prevent Aguna.
Right, but the Gershon is more creative. Now I'm saying the other case is more explicit.
Well, except remember our Gemara here on Gimel and Aleph when it says, why do you think that leniency? Why are you being lenient here? The Gemara says, Mishum Aguna Kilo Rabbana. I mean, the Gemara actually uses that expression. So, So that's the Pnei Yeshua. However, the Noda B'Yehuda doesn't like it. Let's look at the Noda B'Yehuda for a minute. I have it here, the Tshuvas Noda B'Yehuda. It's on page 6. If you look on page 6, Shut Noda B'Yehuda Madura Kama, Evan Ho'ezer Simin Pei Hey. Everybody have that on page 6? So the Noda B'Yehuda kind of, a little bit, makes your argument about this combination, but not so much you need anything less than Shnai Meidim is no good, more like apples and oranges. Like, are you going to combine an Eid Echad, with a Meidag Dayak? But look what he says. He's speaking not about our case initially, then later he comes back to our case, but he starts off talking about the Yevamos case. So he says something very interesting, though. You'll see. It says, it seems to me, some people say that Eid Echad b'misa sabal, one witness being relied upon to establish that the husband is deceased so that she can marry someone else. Some people think that's min Torah. And on the surface, it's astonishing because we need two witnesses in a davar shebe'erva, two witnesses to override Eishasish. How could a single aid saying, meis sabaylech, how could that be enough? V'ayim b'nemuke Yosef, b'sugya idibi vamos, reish perki sharaba, v'gam divrei atosis, peches, divrei asu mitoch chomer, nira l'ri, the late son l'meimar nan sadi, the daike v'neman eid echad b'kach min Torah, elemi takonis chachamim mu'deneman ayin sham. Right, the Bali Tosis say it's only Drabanan. He doesn't quote the best part in Tosis, the one that I quoted, which is that even though it's Drabanan, it's not considered Nakiras Davar Ben Torah. Okay. Then he says about Davar Tamua, Eich Kasokadai Taktan and Sadi. Right, Imkein Lama La Lahaid Klal, Kol Sheisha Shatomer Shechakra Harbe Velonoda La Davar Mibala Neiman and Sadi. Shora Isha Afsha Daika Mikomokom Lo Shama Rak Divrei Ha'ed Umiman Shach O Shalo Yoel Ha'ed O Shalo Titztarech LeHa'ed. So the Rabbi says the following. He basically says, I don't think you can combine Eid Echad and Medak Dayik. They're two completely different ideas. And therefore, oh, thank you. Thank you. It should be page 6, I think. Page 6. It might be the last. Is it the last of the Marmukoma? It's the end. Yeah. But thank you. Page 6. Yeah. Shoot no Yehuda Madura Kama. We're already on like line that is on line 6 within that text. We're up to V'amarti Ani, which we'll get back to in a minute. V'amarti Ani. We'll get back to that in a minute. So you can hold your finger there at 6 lines down. So what is the Rabbi saying? He's saying an amazing thing. He says, listen, either one or the other, either the Eid Echad works, but he's only an Eid Echad, and that's saying Dover Be'er B'Shok Pachas Mishnayim, or say that Medak Dayak works as a kind of an ansadi, but then you don't need the Eid Echad.
Why can't we say it's a two-step proposition? And initially, the person has a chazak of chai. So in order to kill that chazak, you need 2 eidim. Once the first aid comes and says that he's dead, that chazak disappears. Then the Medik Dayak comes, and that's maybe sufficient because the chazaka disappeared.
Oh, so you're very good. You're in a good schwung tonight. The Notable is going to say something like that in just a minute. First, he's rejecting the other idea, which is that Eid Echad plus Medak Dayak is the equivalent, not of 2 eidim, but it's enough for Dover Shebe'erva and Kaskasisa. That he thinks is wrong. But I just want to make it clear. I think that his rejection of that idea is a little bit puzzling. He basically says, not again. Let me make it clear that Eid Echad plus Medak Dayak is still less than and therefore insufficiently consequential to solve the problem of Davar Shebe'erva. That I understand totally. That I think is a 50-50 or even a 75 likelihood to 25.
But that's because you're using it as one piece. But if you split it,
but that's not what he's arguing. What he's arguing is he's saying like this. He's saying something else. He's saying, I don't understand even how there could be a combination. Because either we look at it from an Eidos point of view or from a Medak Dayak. If Medak Dayak is so strong and it works, so then what do we need the Eid Echad for? So here I think it's strange because doesn't it make sense if somebody comes to you, if let's say your husband, the husband disappears and the wife has resources and she's, she hires Sherlock Holmes, to investigate the disappearance. Now she leaves no stone unturned. She goes to the creme de la creme, of investigators. Still, and then she doesn't come up with anything. So after a certain point, the assumption is that he's not coming back. That he's dead. That still wouldn't be in a magnitude of a significant magnitude that wouldn't be far more compelling if also an Eid Echad said, I took his pulse and he died, as opposed to we don't know what happened to him, but we're investigating and no one actually directly saw him die or fall into Mayim Shel himself. Even from a pure Umdana point of view, even if you don't like the combination, the idea that Medak Dayak has nothing to do, the second that there's an Eid Echad, you can say, oh, it's not enough, but there's a certain.
No, but the problem is that when you try to pit the two against each other as entities, nothing matches 2 eidim.
No, that's a different argument. That's not the argument that he's making.
But that's the issue because they want to take Medik Dayak and they want to take the Eid Echad. Put it together.
That I understand.
1 + 1 = 2 eidim, and the answer.
I understand. As I said to you before, that is an argument that I totally understand. Although I think that there's opening to dispute it. Not that Medak Dayak and Eid Echad is the equivalent of 2 eidim, but that maybe sometimes when you require 2 eidim, it's not that you require 2 eidim, it's just that it's insufficient to have 1 eid. And then if you have
a way to beat it is to split it into 2. The two
Right, but I'm saying that's not the Noda B'Yehuda's argument. Noda B'Yehuda's argument is if you're giving so much credence to Medek Dayak, what do you need the Eid Echad for? So what I'm saying is even in a,
only the Eid Echad that makes the Medek Dayak be able to stand on any feet. That's why.
that's what I'm saying. So all right, anyway, so that's what does Noda B'Yehuda himself say? So he ends up saying something very similar to what you were suggesting. What he basically says is that there's another way here, like a more subtle way. Instead of trying to combine Eid Echad and Medek Dayak and say that's sufficient for Davar Shebe'erva or Cheskas Iser, maybe there's another way, and that is to weaken the Cheskas Iser. Maybe weaken the Cheskas Eishes Ish, so then you can rely on the Eid Echad as Eid Echad Naman B'Yisurim. How would you do that? So he says in the case of Yevamos through Medek Dayak. And this is what he says. Amarti Ani, the Yesh L'Kayim, there's 6 lines down, Shtei Adeos, She'eid Echad Naman B'Misa Sabal Min HaTorah. Really, Min HaTorah, we believe Eid Echad B'Misa Sabal. The Alpha Pikein Rak Mitakanis Chachamim. Why? Hainu da Alpidin lo hayaroi lahachmer b'sofa sharei anusa hirak Chachamim mechmir b'sofa v'alidei chein daika b'tchilasa. V'heim divrei Gemara b'Yevamos mitoch chumra shechmarta. Kiven de daika shuv diuka dila mara lecheskas eishas ish. Meaning, in the end of the day, this Durabanan, which requires Medek Daika, ends up undercutting Cheskas Eishes Ish. It makes it at least a suffix. And once that happens, Eid Echad is Naman because it's not connected as Chazak Isura.
Don't you have it backwards? Because the first thing that happened was the Eid Echad. Then came the Medek Dayak.
No, what we're saying is because there's Medek Dayak in the reliance upon this Eid Echad, it ends up being a case of Eid Echad B'li Chazak Isura. And
But the chronology is backwards.
He doesn't care about the chronology.
That's why I thought that the Eid Echad coming first, which takes away the Chazak of Chai. Okay.
No. But he doesn't know. Oh, I see. I didn't understand it that way. No. He's saying the Eid Echad doesn't take away the Cheskas Eishes Ish. The Eid Echad wins because the Medek Dayak takes it away. U'kamosha kasatosis b'Yevamos. I'm going to skip a line. In kain mefurash hadavar shaydei diyuka nasa mivadai l'safek kedinashim talui. B'im kain shuv lo mikri misham b'hala cheskas iser. So then I'm going to skip a little bit. Go now to 6 lines from the bottom. Kain ani omer b'kiyum aget. Kiven demidaraisa kemosha nechkoridusam bebezdin. But here he pulls Reish Lakish. He says, you know what Reish Lakish really does? In addition to Reish Lakish being Eidos, Reish Lakish undercuts the Cheskas Eishes Ish. The Heicha she'ena bal davar toin mezuyaf, right? Hu mekuyim bevadai. The Heicha she'ton mezuyaf mekamokom kfar yatsa mechalal Cheskas Iser lekal safek umigrarea mi Cheskas Iser Eishes Ish. V'shuv Eid Echad Naman min HaTorah. U'lekach afilu osi baal u'ma'arer lo mashkechinan. Then he adds, "B'kolkom bein yeh mitama didi, bein mitama dabe Shmuel, demayir sheheid kodem irurei shalbal," what we referred to before. Because inyan b'fanei nachtav shirak midrabanan avil hoyt shaloi, but tonight tzarich shnei min HaTorah. So basically, the solution, we have the Beis Shmuel solution, which is that it depends what came first. We have the suggestion of the Lechem Mishnah Pnei Yoshua, the combination of Eid Echad and Medek Dayak, even if it isn't Shnai Medim, is still enough in this case to override Cheskas Eishes Ish. And now we have the Noda B'Yehuda's idea that the Medek Dayak neutralizes Cheskas Eishes Ish, and the Eid Echad works b'Torah Eid Echad Nam B'Yisurim. So let me mention 2 other ideas as we have to leave. One of them is a Pnei Yoshua. I'm not going to read it inside, but maybe I will next week. I'll just mention this one now. The Pnei Yoshua, like the Noda B'Yehuda, suggests a solution for the Rambam and Rabbi Vigdor based on Eid Echad Naman B'Yisurim. But his idea is to completely reread the Gemara in Gittin on Gimel Amud Aleph to begin with. And he says the following. Basically, the question is as follows. When we're talking about testimony about whether she's an Eishes Ish, that's Davar Shebe'erva. That's a Chazak Isura. That's Al Pishnai made it, right? But if we're talking about testimony, and this goes back to something that we discussed earlier tonight, we were talking about the Yachid Mumcha, et cetera. You asked me, how can a Yachid Mumcha work in Erva, et cetera, right? So if we're talking about substantiating the signatures of a contract, right, is that Eidus or is that Eidach and B'Yisurin? Because on the one hand, what does it impact a get?
You want to say it's one step removed?
It impacts the get. In that respect, it's Davar Shebe'erva and Cheskas Ish.
Not direct.
However, one second. The content of the testimony is not about the get, it's about the signatures. And it's Milsa David Peguya.
Not semantics, but
Not semantics. If you look very carefully at the Gemaras and Ksuvas that discuss the principle of Kiyum Shtaros, this is a very big issue. And in general, this is a question in Eidach and B'Yisurin. For example, I'll give you one example. But we'll speak more about it. Let's say the Gemara says in Yevamos, famous Gemara, Ishtamo De'inu, to identify the brother of the mace, that can be done by an Eid Echad, even though the effect of that will be to qualify this person for Yibum, which is a Davar Shebe'erva. I'll give you another example where it's a machlokes between the Ramban and the Ran. Like a person sends a shliach, to be Makadish and Isha for him. He doesn't specify. Okay? He's not picky, So, shidduch crisis, whatever it is. So he sends a shliach on the way, he says, wherever you find. Either he says wherever you find or wherever you feel is appropriate. Okay. Meanwhile, the shliach, never comes back to him, but there's a chazaka shliach osa shlichus, say the Gemara says. So the shliach was mekadesh somebody on his behalf, and then he died without communicating who the mekudeshes was.
like Eliezer.
So the question is, he can't marry anybody because, anybody else who we want to marry might be the sister or the mother.
Like Yitzchak and Eliezer.
What?
Like Yitzchak and Eliezer.
Yeah. So, and we say, so that's a problem. So then there's a debate in the Rishonim.
We don't go by rove.
Let's say an Eid Echad can say, I was at the wedding and it's her. Only an Eid Echad. Is that Eid Echad and B'Yisurin? Is that Davar Shebe'erva? What I'm trying to point out is that sometimes you have the consequence of the testimony is Davar Shebe'erva, or Ishus, or Mominus, or as the case may be, or Malchus. But the Tochen, we had the case in the Rambam before, remember? The Eid Echad shows up in court and he says, this is Chalev, right? And now somebody eats it. That's one case. Or there's a din Torah, this guy ate something. They claim that it's Chalev, but we don't know for sure. Can Eid Echad be the one who establishes after the fact? Meaning there are gray areas, which we will explore a little more, between what is Eid Echad and B'Yisurin and what is Davar Shebe'erva and Cheskas Ish. So the Pnei Yeshua says, I think everybody read the Gemara, or at least according to the Rambam and Rabbi Vigdor, everybody read the Gemara in Gimel Amud Aleph inaccurately. How should you read the Gemara in Gimel Amud Aleph? And with this we'll conclude. The Gemara says again, the Gemara said, listen, you can't rely on B'fanei Nechtam, which is said by a Shliach, because you need two Eidim. It's a Davar Shebe'erva. It's a Chazak Isura. So then what does the Gemara answer? I'm going to read it inside again. The Gemara says, B'dinu de b'kiyum shtaros nami lo libai. Kiyum shtaros is not a problem. Kid Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish, Edom asum al ashtar nasa commission achar disum bebezdin. Rabbanan hu da'atzrach. V'hochem mishum aguna kila b'rabbana. So everybody reads this Gemara as saying that Minatorah, you don't need Minatorah. If there's a dispute, if the Baal is Ma'arer, it's protected by Reish Lakish. And that's how the Or Zarua read the Gemara, and that's how the Shach read the Gemara, and that's how, pretty much everybody read the Gemara. The Gemara is saying, Kim Shtaros is Drabanan, because Minatora Reish Lakish always protects, and you don't need anything. Pnei Yeshua says that's not the way the Rambam read the Gemara. It's not the way Rabbi Vigdor read the Gemara. They read the Gemara the following way. The Gemara originally said, how can you rely on B'fanei Nachtav? That's only Eid Echad. Eid Echad only works in Isurim. So the Gemara says, it's not a problem because of Reish Lakish. And since there's a din of Reish Lakish, and we're only talking about being Mekayim, the Chosamos of the Shtar, Minat Torah, that only requires Eid Echad, because that's Eid Echad Naman B'Yisurim. Since it's Eid Echad Naman B'Yisurim, it works with an Eid Echad. So basically, the way that the Rambam would read the Gemara is the Gemara is not saying Kim Shtaros D'Rabbanan Midaraisa, you don't need anything. The Gemara is saying Kim Shtaros is D'Rabbanan, and that's why Minat Torah, right? You can get a Kim Shtaros D'Rabbanan means it's not a Davar Shebe'erva, it's Isurim. And therefore, it's only Midrabanan that you require 2 Eidim. Minat Torah, you should be able to get away not with nothing, but with an Eid Echad. But if you have an Eid Echad, that works Minat Torah. So they suggest that's the pshat in the Rambam and Rabbi Vigdor. Okay, I'm going to mention one other option to explain the Rambam and Rabbi Vigdor next time, which is going to fit into the first page of our Mar Makomos, where we're going to discuss a little bit, what about other forms of attacking the integrity of a shtar? Not Mezuyaf, that it's a forgery, but things like, the Edamar Psulim, there was an additional condition that isn't spelled out in the shtar, but was orally.
But that flies directly in the face of Reish Lakish. I mean, he's
Yeah,
trying.
so we're going to discuss that. Is it better?
You
We're
can't
gonna
do that
discuss
kind of stuff.
Better, equal, or worse? That's what we're going to discuss next time. But not next time, next week. Next week, the shir will meet at 6:30 instead of 7:30. And we'll be discussing some theme related to upcoming Chag HaShavuos. And then a week after that, we'll finish with this, and we'll also discuss Eid Echad Naman B'Yisurim.
Okay, thank you so much, Rabbi. Have a good night. Thank you.
Good week, everybody, and we look forward to next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.